The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock my grandfather had painstakingly restored, a clock that now seemed to mock me with its steady march forward, a march I couldn't join. I stared at the invitation in my hand, the embossed lettering blurring through the unshed tears stinging my eyes. 30 years. 30 years of marriage, and I, Cora, their daughter, wasn't deemed worthy of a seat at the celebration. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I just accepted. They were so very wrong. If you have ever felt the sting of family betrayal, subscribe now to see how Cora turns the tables. The excuse, delivered with practiced ease by my mother over the phone, was limited seating. A small, intimate gathering, she'd cooed, mostly family friends who'd known them since the beginning. It wasn't personal, darling, she'd assured me, just a matter of logistics. But the hollowness in her voice, the way she rushed the explanation, it all screamed of a lie. My sister Sarah was going. Of course she was. Always the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in their eyes. And Mark, my brother, he'd be there too, probably regaling everyone with his latest stock market triumphs. Me? I was conveniently excluded, tucked away out of sight, as if my presence would somehow tarnish their perfect image. They'd always treated me differently, ever since I was little. I was always too loud, too opinionated, too much. Sarah was the quiet one, the compliant one, the one who always knew how to play the game. Mark was the charmer, the one who could sweet-talk his way out of any situation. And I was just Cora, the inconvenient truth they preferred to ignore. The invitation felt like a slap in the face, a confirmation of everything I'd always suspected. I wasn't really one of them. I was an outsider looking in, forever on the periphery of their carefully constructed world. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it didn't matter, but it did. It mattered because it was my parents. It mattered because it was their anniversary. It mattered because I wanted to be there to celebrate with them, to raise a glass to their enduring love, to tell them how much they meant to me, but they didn't want me there. And that realization cut deeper than any insult ever could. I replayed past conversations, searching for clues, for some explanation for this blatant exclusion. There was the time my father scoffed at my career choice, a social worker, helping families in need. "Not exactly a path to riches, is it, Cora?" he'd said, his tone dripping with disdain. And the countless times my mother had criticized my appearance, my clothes, my hair. "You should really try to be more like Sarah," she'd often say, as if Sarah were some unattainable ideal. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a constant chipping away at my self-esteem. They'd built a narrative where I was the black sheep, the screw-up, the one who never quite measured up. And now they were using that narrative to justify my exclusion from their milestone celebration. I felt a cold anger settle in my stomach, a quiet determination to not let them win. The day of the party arrived, and I busied myself with mundane tasks, trying to distract myself from the images swirling in my head. Sarah laughing and chatting with my parents, Mark toasting their success. Me, nowhere. I imagined the carefully curated photos that would inevitably flood social media, the smiling faces, the perfect family portrait, with a conspicuous absence where I should have been. I knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. It wasn't just about being excluded from a party. It felt like something bigger, something darker was at play. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being deliberately shut out, not just from their celebration, but from their lives. And then a notification popped up on my phone. A photo, posted by Sarah, with the caption, "Celebrating Mom and Dad's big day. So much love." There they were, all of them, beaming at the camera, a picture of familial bliss. But it wasn't the happy faces that caught my attention. It was the background, the venue. It wasn't some small, intimate gathering. It was a lavish ballroom overflowing with guests. Limited seating? It was a blatant lie. The anger that had been simmering inside me finally reached a boiling point. I knew, in that moment, that I couldn't let this go. I had to find out why. I had to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The person I trusted most was one of them. It was Aunt Carol. She had always been different from the rest of my mother's family, more down to earth, more real. She called me a few days after the party, her voice hushed and apologetic. "Cora, honey, I need to tell you something," she began, her words hesitant. "It's about your parents and the house." My heart pounded in my chest. The house? What could possibly be wrong with the house? That's when she told me about the mortgage, a second mortgage, taken out secretly, without my knowledge. And the worst part? My name was on it. Somehow, they'd used my identity, forged my signature to secure the loan. The party, the exclusion, it all suddenly made sense. They didn't want me around because they were afraid I'd find out. They were afraid I'd expose their lies. Aunt Carol explained that she'd stumbled upon some documents while helping my parents organize their finances. She was horrified by what she found and felt compelled to tell me, despite the potential repercussions. "I know this is going to hurt, Cora," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but you deserve to know the truth." The truth. It was a bitter pill to swallow. My own parents, the people who were supposed to love and protect me, had betrayed me in the most profound way imaginable. They had not only excluded me from their lives, but had also put my financial future at risk. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, followed by a surge of anger so intense it threatened to consume me. But beneath the anger, a new emotion began to emerge: determination. They had underestimated me. They had thought I was weak, easily manipulated, someone they could control. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The weight of Aunt Carol's revelation crashed down on me, a suffocating blanket of betrayal and fear. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' faces, their smiles twisted into grotesque masks of deception. The ticking of the grandfather clock, once a comforting sound of home, now echoed in my mind like a countdown to some impending disaster. I tried to reason with myself, to find some explanation, some mitigating circumstance that could justify their actions. Maybe it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew the truth. They had deliberately and calculatedly used me, putting my financial security at risk for their own selfish gain. The first call I made was to the bank. I stammered, trying to explain the situation to the customer service representative, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. But the news I received was even worse than I had imagined. The loan was substantial, nearly draining the equity in the house, and if they defaulted, I would be held liable. My parents had not only betrayed me emotionally, they had also jeopardized my entire future. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, a wave of despair washing over me. I felt like I was drowning, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Desperate, I decided to confront them directly. Maybe, just maybe, they would have some explanation, some remorse. I drove to their house, my heart pounding in my chest, rehearsing the words I wanted to say. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw Sarah's car parked in front. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. What were they up to? I took a deep breath and walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorbell. My mother answered, her face etched with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Cora, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold and unwelcoming. I tried to remain calm, to keep the anger from bubbling to the surface. "I need to talk to you and Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly opened the door wider. As I stepped inside, I saw my father and Sarah sitting in the living room, their faces grim. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a silent acknowledgement of the wrong they had done. "What is this about, Cora?" my father asked, his voice sharp and defensive. I laid it all out, the phone call from Aunt Carol, the loan, the forged signature. As I spoke, their faces hardened, their expressions shifting from annoyance to anger. They denied everything, of course. "It was a mistake," they said, "a misunderstanding. Aunt Carol was just trying to cause trouble." But their eyes betrayed them. I saw the flicker of guilt, the shadow of fear. I knew they were lying. The confrontation quickly devolved into a shouting match, accusations flying back and forth like poisoned darts. Sarah joined in, defending her parents, accusing me of being dramatic and paranoid.
"You always have to make everything about you, Cora," she screamed, her face contorting with rage. "Can't you just be happy for Mom and Dad for once?" Happy? How could I be happy when my own parents had stabbed me in the back? I tried to reason with them, to appeal to their sense of decency, but it was no use. They were determined to protect themselves, even if it meant sacrificing me. As I turned to leave, defeated and heartbroken, my father said something that cut me to the core. "You were always a disappointment, Cora," he sneered, his eyes filled with contempt. "We should have known you'd cause trouble." Those words echoed in my mind long after I left their house, a confirmation of everything I had always feared. I was a disappointment. I was not worthy of their love. I was nothing to them but an inconvenience. I drove home in a daze, tears streaming down my face, the weight of their betrayal crushing me. I felt utterly alone, abandoned by the people who were supposed to be my family. The anger that had been simmering inside me finally erupted, a raging inferno of rage and resentment. I knew, in that moment, that I couldn't let them get away with this. I had to fight back. I had to expose their lies and make them pay for what they had done. But how? They were powerful, wealthy, and connected. I was just Cora, the social worker, the black sheep. I spent weeks agonizing over my options, pacing the floor late into the night, my mind racing with possibilities. I considered hiring a lawyer, but I knew that would be a long and expensive battle, and I wasn't sure I could afford it. I thought about going to the police, but I worried that they wouldn't take me seriously, especially against my parents' influence. Every avenue seemed blocked. Every path led to a dead end. I felt like I was trapped in a maze with no way out. The stress began to take its toll. I lost weight, my hair started to fall out, and I became withdrawn and irritable. My friends tried to help, but I pushed them away, unable to confide in them about the depth of my pain. I was ashamed, embarrassed by my parents' actions, afraid of being judged. The injustice of it all consumed me, the knowledge that they were living their lives, enjoying their wealth and status, while I was struggling to cope with the consequences of their actions. I started having nightmares, reliving the confrontation, hearing my father's cruel words over and over again. The ticking of the grandfather clock became a torment, a constant reminder of the time I was wasting, the opportunities I was missing.
I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I felt powerless, trapped, and utterly alone. Their biggest weakness? They thought they were untouchable. It was during one of my sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling, that the idea came to me. A risky, audacious idea, but one that I couldn't shake. What if I could expose them publicly? Not through legal channels, but through the court of public opinion. What if I could use their own arrogance, their own sense of invincibility, against them? It was a long shot, but it was the only option I could see. I started researching, digging into their past, looking for any skeletons in their closet, any secrets they were desperate to keep hidden. It was a painstaking process, but I was fueled by a burning desire for justice. I spent hours poring over documents, scouring public records, interviewing people who had known them for years, and slowly, painstakingly, I began to piece together a picture of their true selves, a picture that was far different from the carefully constructed image they presented to the world. I discovered a pattern of deception, a history of shady business dealings, and a string of broken promises. They had cheated partners, manipulated employees, and exploited loopholes to amass their wealth. And they had done it all with a smile on their faces, convincing everyone that they were pillars of the community. But their biggest weakness was their vanity, their need for admiration. They craved the spotlight, they reveled in their social status, and they believed they were above reproach. It was this arrogance that would ultimately be their undoing. The days that followed were a blur of despair and frantic activity. I lost my job. My performance at work had been slipping for weeks, my mind consumed by my parents' betrayal. A careless error, born from exhaustion and lack of focus, cost the company a significant contract, and I was let go. Restructuring, they called it, but I knew the truth. I was a liability. Another failure in a life that seemed to be defined by them. The small savings I had were quickly dwindling.
eaten up by bills and the growing fear of homelessness. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't find any solace from the crushing weight of my situation. I was alone, jobless, and potentially facing financial ruin, all because of my parents' greed. One evening, as the shadows lengthened in my tiny apartment, I found myself staring blankly at a bottle of pills. The darkness whispered, promising an end to the pain, a release from the constant anxiety. It would be so easy, a simple solution to a problem that seemed insurmountable. For a long moment, I teetered on the edge, the siren song of oblivion pulling me closer. But then, a flicker of defiance ignited within me, a refusal to let them win, to let them define my life, even in my unaliving. The image of their smug faces flashed before my eyes, and a cold, hard resolve settled in my heart. I would not give them the satisfaction. I would not let them break me completely. I slammed the bottle down on the counter, the sound echoing in the silence. Tears streamed down my face, but this time they were not tears of despair, but of anger and determination. I would not be a victim. I would not let them steal my future. I would fight back, and I would make them pay for what they had done. I spent the next few days in a frenzy of activity, fueled by a desperate need for control. I started by meticulously documenting everything. Every phone call, every email, every conversation. I created a detailed timeline of events, highlighting the inconsistencies and the lies. I gathered all the evidence I could find, meticulously organizing it into a comprehensive case against them. It was a slow, painstaking process, but it gave me a sense of purpose, a feeling that I was finally taking control of my life. I also started researching my parents' business dealings, digging deeper into their past, looking for any illegal or ethical violations. I spent hours poring over financial records, corporate filings, and news articles, searching for any clues that could help me expose their true nature. I knew it was a long shot, but I was determined to leave no stone unturned. The anger that had been consuming me began to transform into a cold, calculating rage. I was no longer just a victim. I was a strategist, a planner, a warrior preparing for battle. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed allies, people who could help me gather information, navigate the legal system, and amplify my message. But who could I trust? My parents had always been skilled at manipulating people, at cultivating a loyal following. I had no doubt that they had spies everywhere, people who would report back to them if I started asking too many questions. I had to be careful, strategic, and discreet. I started by reaching out to a few former colleagues, people I knew I could trust, people who had seen firsthand the kind of people my parents truly were. I confided in them about my situation, sharing the evidence I had gathered and asking for their help. To my surprise, they were eager to assist. They had long suspected that my parents were involved in shady dealings, and they were happy to see them finally brought to justice. They provided me with valuable information, leads to follow, and introductions to other potential allies. Slowly but surely, I began to build a network of support, a team of dedicated individuals who were committed to helping me expose the truth. It was a risky undertaking, but I knew it was the only way to win. I was no longer just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone who had ever been hurt by my parents' greed and deceit. The game had changed. I was no longer playing by their rules. I was creating my own, and I was going to win. The game had begun, and I was no longer playing by their rules. I smiled sweetly at my mother during our weekly lunches, listening patiently as she bragged about Sarah's latest achievements and subtly disparaged my own life choices. I nodded along as my father regaled me with tales of his business successes, careful to feign interest while secretly recording every word. They thought I was finally coming around, that I was accepting my place in their world. They couldn't have been more wrong. I was documenting everything, every lie, every manipulation, every veiled threat. I invested in a high-quality digital recorder, small enough to conceal in my purse or even my clothing, and I used it constantly. Every conversation, every phone call, every interaction was meticulously recorded and transcribed. I knew that this evidence would be crucial in exposing their true nature, improving their guilt beyond any doubt. I learned about chain of evidence, forensic audio analysis, and how to protect my recordings from being dismissed in any future legal challenge. It became an obsession. One afternoon, while helping my mother sort through some old family photos, I stumbled upon a box of documents hidden in the back of a closet. My heart leaped into my throat as I recognized my father's signature on a series of suspicious-looking contracts. They were dated years ago, but they seemed to involve a shell corporation and a series of questionable transactions. I knew I had hit the jackpot. I subtly slipped the documents into my purse, making a mental note to have them analyzed by a forensic accountant. My hands trembled as I drove home, the weight of my discovery pressing down on me. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from falling into the abyss. They couldn't suspect a thing. I had to keep up the facade, to continue playing the dutiful daughter while secretly plotting their downfall. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but I knew I couldn't stop. I was too close to the truth, too close to justice. The biggest challenge was Sarah. She was always around, hovering protectively over my parents, quick to defend them against any perceived slight. She saw me as a threat, an outsider trying to disrupt their perfect family. And she was right, in a way. But I couldn't let her suspicions deter me. I had to find a way to get close to her, to gain her trust, to use her own loyalty against her. I started by complimenting her, praising her accomplishments, and showing an interest in her life. It was difficult, forcing myself to be nice to someone I despised, but I knew it was necessary. Slowly, gradually, she began to let her guard down. She started confiding in me, sharing her fears and insecurities, revealing her own vulnerabilities. And as she did, I listened intently, searching for any weaknesses I could exploit. One evening, Sarah invited me to a charity gala that my parents were hosting. I hesitated at first, unsure if I could stomach spending an entire evening in their presence. But then I realized that this was an opportunity I couldn't afford to miss. It was a chance to gather more evidence, to observe their interactions with other powerful people, and to plant seeds of doubt in their carefully constructed world. I accepted the invitation, determined to make the most of it. I purchased a stunning dress, practiced my most charming smile, and prepared myself for an evening of deception. As I walked into the ballroom, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The room was filled with wealthy, influential people, all of them eager to curry favor with my parents. It was a grotesque display of power and privilege, and it made my blood boil. I circulated through the crowd, pretending to be interested in their vapid conversations, all the while discreetly recording everything. I watched as my parents schmoozed and flattered, spinning their web of lies, convincing everyone that they were pillars of the community. It was sickening. I wanted to scream, to expose them right then and there, but I knew I had to remain patient. The time would come. As the evening progressed, I noticed my father slipping away from the crowd, heading towards a private room in the back of the ballroom. My instincts told me that something was up. I excused myself from my conversation and discreetly followed him, careful to stay out of sight. I peeked through the crack in the door and saw him meeting with a group of men I didn't recognize. They were huddled around a table, poring over documents and speaking in hushed tones. I strained to hear what they were saying, but the music was too loud. I needed to get closer. I remembered that there was a service entrance to the room, used by the catering staff. I slipped out of the ballroom and made my way to the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed open the door and walked inside, pretending to be a waitress. The men looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. My father's face turned crimson with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. I stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. I was just delivering some drinks," I said, my voice trembling. He glared at me for a moment, then dismissed me with a wave of his hand. "Get out of here," he said. I quickly turned and left the room, my mind racing. I knew I had stumbled upon something big, something that could potentially destroy them. I just needed to figure out what it was. Back in my apartment, I reviewed the recordings I had made that evening, searching for any clues that could help me decipher what my father and his cronies were planning. I enhanced the audio, filtering out the background noise, and listened intently to their hushed conversations. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to piece together the puzzle. They were involved in a scheme to defraud investors, using a series of shell corporations and offshore accounts to siphon off millions of dollars. It was a complex, elaborate plan, but I was determined to unravel it. I spent the next few days poring over financial records, corporate filings, and news articles, trying to find any connections between my father and the shell corporations. It was a tedious process, but I refused to give up. I knew that this was my chance to expose their true nature, to bring them to justice for their crimes, and I wouldn't let anything stand in my way. The days were ticking by, each one bringing me closer to my final move. The anxiety was building, but beneath it, anticipation. The break I needed came unexpectedly, delivered on a silver platter of sibling rivalry. Sarah, fueled by a potent mix of ambition and insecurity, had always felt overshadowed by my parents' success. She craved their approval, their recognition, but no matter how hard she tried, she always seemed to fall short. I sensed her resentment, her suppressed anger, and I knew I could use it to my advantage. One evening, after a particularly tense family dinner, Sarah cornered me in the kitchen, her eyes flashing with barely concealed rage. She started ranting about my parents' unfair treatment, their constant criticism, their unwavering belief that she could never measure up. I listened patiently, nodding sympathetically, letting her vent her frustrations. And then, when she was at her most vulnerable, I gently steered the conversation towards their business dealings. I asked her if she knew anything about their offshore accounts, their shell corporations, their questionable investments. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Then, in a hushed voice, she confessed that she did. She had stumbled upon some documents a few years ago, hidden in my father's office, that suggested they were involved in something illegal. She had confronted them about it, but they had dismissed her concerns, telling her it was none of her business. She had been too afraid to pursue it further, but the knowledge had been eating away at her ever since. I pressed her gently, asking her if she still had the documents. She said she did, locked away in a safe deposit box at a local bank. She had been planning to use them as leverage, as a way to finally gain my parents' respect, but she had never had the courage to act. I saw my opportunity. I offered her a deal. If she gave me the documents, I would help her expose my parents' crimes, and together we would bring them to justice.
She looked at me skeptically, unsure if she could trust me, but I could see the desperation in her eyes, the longing for revenge. After a long moment of hesitation, she agreed. The next day, Sarah and I met at a coffee shop near the bank. She was visibly nervous, fidgeting with her hands and avoiding eye contact. She handed me a key to the safe deposit box, her fingers trembling. I took the key and thanked her, promising that I wouldn't let her down. I drove to the bank, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like I was on the verge of a breakthrough, that I was finally about to uncover the truth. I presented the key to the bank teller and was led to a small, private room. I inserted the key into the lock and opened the safe deposit box. Inside, I found a stack of documents, neatly organized in a manila folder. I took a deep breath and began to examine them. They were even more damning than I had imagined. They detailed a complex web of financial transactions, showing how my parents had been siphoning off millions of dollars from their company into offshore accounts. They had been using the money to fund their lavish lifestyle, to buy expensive cars and luxurious homes, to travel the world in style. It was all there, in black and white, proof of their greed and corruption. I carefully copied all the documents, making sure to preserve the originals for future use. I knew that this evidence would be enough to bring them down, to destroy their reputation, to send them to prison. The game had changed. I had the smoking gun. Now, the real fun began. I had the evidence. I had Sarah's grudging alliance. Now I needed to set the stage. I decided to use their charity gala, the very scene of their perceived triumph, as the platform for their downfall. I subtly suggested to my mother that we honor Sarah at the gala for her contributions to the family business. I knew it would appeal to her vanity, the need to present a picture of a perfect, harmonious family. My mother, predictably, loved the idea. She envisioned a tearful Sarah, publicly acknowledging her parents' greatness, solidifying their image as benevolent benefactors. The date was set, the invitations were sent, and the stage was set for the final act. I spent the next few weeks meticulously planning every detail. I contacted a reputable investigative journalist, someone I knew I could trust to handle the story with integrity and discretion. I provided her with copies of the documents, along with a detailed account of my parents' crimes. She was shocked by what she read and immediately agreed to investigate. I also reached out to a few of my parents' former business partners, people who had been burned by their shady dealings. I knew they would be eager to see them brought to justice, and I needed their support to amplify my message. I crafted a speech, a carefully worded exposé that would reveal the truth about my parents' true nature.
It was a risky move, but I knew it was the only way to ensure that the story got the attention it deserved. I rehearsed the speech countless times, making sure I could deliver it with confidence and conviction. I knew that I had to be prepared for anything, that my parents would stop at nothing to protect their reputation. The tension was almost unbearable. Each tick of the clock brought me closer to the moment of truth. I could barely sleep, barely eat. My mind was racing, filled with images of the gala, of my parents' faces when they realized they had been exposed. I knew it was going to be explosive, a complete and utter disaster for them, and I couldn't wait. The day of the gala arrived, and I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. I spent the morning getting ready, carefully selecting my outfit, practicing my smile, steeling myself for the confrontation to come. I knew that this was the day my life would change forever, that there was no turning back. As I drove to the ballroom, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. What if my plan failed? What if my parents managed to silence me, to bury the truth? What if I ended up destroying my own life in the process? But then I remembered all the pain they had caused, all the lies they had told, all the people they had hurt, and I knew that I couldn't back down. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. The ballroom was even more opulent than I remembered, filled with glittering chandeliers, lavish floral arrangements, and elegantly dressed guests. My parents were holding court near the entrance, greeting their guests with practiced smiles and warm handshakes. I took a deep breath and walked towards them, determined to play my part. "Darling, you look stunning," my mother gushed, pulling me into a tight hug. "We're so glad you could make it." My father clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes glinting with pride. "We have a special surprise for you tonight," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. I smiled sweetly and nodded, pretending to be oblivious to their impending doom. "I'm so excited," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is going to be a night to remember." As the evening progressed, I circulated through the crowd, making small talk, gathering information, and waiting for my moment. I could feel the tension building, the anticipation growing. The journalist was here, discreetly observing the scene, ready to pounce when the time was right. My parents' former business partners were here, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. Sarah was here, her face pale, her hands trembling. She knew what was about to happen, and she was terrified, but she was also determined to see it through. The moment of truth was fast approaching. The band struck up a fanfare, and the master of ceremonies took to the stage.
"Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming through the ballroom, "it is my distinct honor to introduce two very special people, two pillars of our community, two individuals who have dedicated their lives to making the world a better place. Mr. and Mrs. He trailed off, waiting for the applause to subside, but it never came. Instead, a hush fell over the room, a silence so profound that you could hear a pin drop. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, my voice trembling slightly as I uttered 3 words that would change everything. Not anymore. Not anymore. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusations, the silence amplifying their impact. Every head in the ballroom swiveled towards me, faces etched with confusion, curiosity, and a growing sense of unease. My parents stood frozen, their smiles faltering, their eyes widening in disbelief. My mother was the first to break the silence, her voice sharp and brittle. "What do you mean, not anymore?" she demanded, her hand instinctively reaching for my father's arm. I ignored her, my gaze fixed on the crowd, my voice gaining strength with each word. For years, my parents have presented themselves as pillars of this community, as generous philanthropists, as model citizens. But the truth is far more sinister. I paused, taking a deep breath, letting the weight of my words sink in. They are criminals. They have built their fortune on lies, deceit, and the exploitation of others. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a flurry of whispers. My father stepped forward, his face contorted with rage, his voice a low growl. "How dare you?" he hissed. "You are a disgrace to this family. Security, get her out of here." But the security guards hesitated, unsure of what to do, their eyes darting nervously between my parents and me. I pressed on, my voice ringing clear and true. I have spent the last few months gathering evidence, uncovering their elaborate scheme to defraud investors, to siphon off millions of dollars into offshore accounts. I have documents, witnesses, and irrefutable proof of their crimes. I gestured towards the journalist, who stepped forward, holding up a file folder containing the damning evidence. "This is just a fraction of what I have uncovered.
The full story will be revealed in tomorrow's headlines, thanks to the tireless work of this investigative journalist. Panic flickered in my parents' eyes, their carefully constructed facade crumbling before their very eyes. They knew they were cornered, that there was no escape. My mother began to cry, her sobs echoing through the silent ballroom. "How could you do this to us?" she wailed. "We are your parents." I looked at her, my heart aching with a mixture of sadness and anger. "You ceased being my parents the moment you chose greed over integrity, the moment you betrayed the trust of those who believed in you." I turned my attention back to the crowd, my voice filled with righteous indignation. "I know that many of you have invested in my parents' company, that you have trusted them with your money, your futures. I am here to tell you that you have been deceived. They have been using your investments to line their own pockets, to fund their lavish lifestyle, to live a life of luxury at your expense." A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd, faces turning from shock to anger. People began to shout questions, demanding answers, demanding justice. The room descended into chaos, a cacophony of accusations and recriminations. In the midst of the pandemonium, my parents attempted to slip away, to escape the consequences of their actions. But I was ready for them. I had alerted the authorities, who were waiting outside the ballroom, ready to take them into custody. As they reached the door, they were met by a phalanx of police officers, who quickly placed them under arrest. My father struggled, his face red with fury, but it was no use. He and my mother were led away in handcuffs, their reign of terror finally at an end. The ballroom was a scene of utter devastation, the glittering facade shattered, revealing the ugliness that lay beneath. People were weeping, shouting, arguing, their dreams and fortunes lying in ruins. Sarah approached me, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You did what I could never do." I put my arm around her, offering her a comforting embrace. "We did it together," I said, "and we will rebuild together." As I watched my parents being led away, I felt a sense of closure, of justice served. The pain and anger I had carried for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of peace and liberation. They had lost everything: their fortune, their reputation, their freedom, and I just smiled. The fallout was swift and brutal. The news of my parents' arrest spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and sparking outrage around the world. Their company was immediately seized by authorities, their assets frozen, their empire crumbling to dust. The investors they had defrauded filed lawsuits, seeking to recover their losses, adding to the already mounting pressure. My parents were ostracized by their former friends and colleagues, abandoned by those who had once clamored for their attention. They were pariahs, their names synonymous with greed and corruption. The trial was a media circus, every detail scrutinized, every accusation dissected. My parents tried to defend themselves, to deny their guilt, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. The model behaved as a specified entity. Sarah and I worked tirelessly to help the victims of my parents' crimes, to provide them with support and resources to rebuild their lives. It was a long and difficult process, but we were determined to make amends for the harm that had been done. We established a foundation to support ethical business practices and to promote financial literacy, hoping to prevent others from falling victim to similar scams. Slowly but surely, we began to heal the wounds that my parents had inflicted, to create a better future for ourselves and for our community. Revenge isn't sweet. It's necessary. It's about reclaiming what was stolen, about standing up for what is right, about holding those who abuse their power accountable for their actions. It's about healing, about justice, about creating a world where no one is above the law. Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more justice.